All right, I'm going to be reading from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desire, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Where did Steve go? He's out there. He's also the Beacon Deacon this month. So thank you, Steve, for doing that. I appreciate any plugs that we get for Camp Are Good. It's obviously something that is important to our church. So if you're new here and you have children, then understand that camp is important to us. We participate in it every single year, and it's always a fun opportunity for us. With that said, I kind of a little bit of communication issue with me and Steve this week. He thought he was preaching on about Wednesday or so, and I thought I was preaching on about Wednesday or so. So had Fran not prompted me to the idea that Steve thinks he's actually preaching, that would have been really awkward, because we would have both come up at the same time, and that would have just been awkward. So we decided, I said, okay, I'll meet you halfway. You do half, and I'll do half. So he did his half, so I'll keep it brief this morning. But I do want to cover off on a little bit of the missions theme that we've been tracing for the last couple of weeks here. People who represent God to the world. We'll come back and look at this passage in just a moment, as well as another one that Jason read. But in 2009, on the side of London's big red buses, some local atheists, including Richard Dawkins, who is an atheist, paid for a campaign for signs to be placed on the side of these red buses in London. And I don't know if you can read it or not. It's kind of fuzzy. I couldn't get any really good pictures of it. And Dominic didn't even know this. So I was talking to Dominic this morning, and he didn't realize that this was the case. In 2009, it says, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Now, we could spend weeks sort of unpacking that and all the assumptions that go into that. We're not going to do that. But I do want to ask the question, what drives a statement like this? Okay, in one sense, there's arrogance, there's elitism, there's the idea that, religion is for the common folk, the smart people are all atheists. So there's probably a little bit of the arrogance that kind of drives that overall discussion. We talked about this a while back. We had a Wednesday night series entitled "The Reason for God," where we kind of looked at, sort of atheist claims and things like that. We're not going to rehearse that, but some of that drives that. But to me, it's a little bit more practical than that. What is it that these atheists are seeing in the lives of Christians that prompts a comment like this? Like, I would appreciate the discussion more if it was just sort of about like kind of scientific proofs and theories and things like that, because then it's just sort of like a head game, right? Who can outsmart the other side, right? That's one discussion. But what drives this statement, at least in the eyes of many, is what the lives of Christians typically look like. And that's what drives this statement, is that, at least in their view, Christians are people who worry. Christians are people who are full of anxiety. Christians are people who believe in God, but that's even secondary. It's what do their lives look like? And so what this kind of, when I read this, and I kind of wrestled with this some yesterday, that it's the fact that, like it or not, if you're a professing Christian, your life is representing God to the world. Like it or not. Now the question is, what is that representation? What is that reflection? Is our reflection of God this sort of, stuffy, stuck-up, stuffy-headed, God up there that won't let anybody have any fun. And that we live in a world where we're full of anxiety, we're full of fear, and we're full of, all these kind of things. I mean, that's a view of God. I think it's a mistaken view of God, but it's a view of God. So the question that we have to ask as we talk about this series on missions is, what are we reflecting of God to the world? When we leave this building this morning and we go to lunch and we interact with people who, may not be Christians, there's an expectation that's placed on us that we reflect the God that we just got done worshiping here for an hour. In other words, we can't walk out of this building and look exactly like the atheists and the immoral, and I know not all atheists are immoral, I'm painting in broad strokes here. But we can't walk out of this building and look like the people of the world and draw them to God. The idea behind the passage that Jason read is that basically, be different in a world that looks like this. Look like this. Be different. As God would say in Leviticus, be holy as I am holy. And as Peter would echo to the church that he's writing, we'll look at the passage in a moment, be a kingdom of priests. Be a holy nation, that when the world looks at you, they see who? They see God. When they look at our lives, that is a representation of what we believe God to be. So if we're worried, the implication, if we're full of anxiety, the implication is that we worship a God that really doesn't take very good care of us. Because we worry all the time about everything, about things that are beyond our control. If we're stuffy-headed and bitter and angry and, cantankerous, then that must be what our God is. And so the way that we represent God speaks to the world in some way, shape, or form. And that's what kind of drives that statement. So I want to look at, what do our lives say? How do we speak to people? Not even verbally, but with our actions and with our lifestyles. How does that reflect God? So as Peter, the passage that Jason read just a moment ago, and we're not going to go back and reread it all, but as Peter is exhorting this church that he's writing to, the basic idea is the same idea that Moses tried to get across to Israel shortly after the Exodus, right after he was about to give the Ten Commandments. And God is exhorting Moses and God is exhorting the people. And we've looked at this kind of idea before, that the basic idea for Israel was to stand out, to be a light to the nations, and he didn't mean go out and preach to them all the time. It was the way that they lived their lives, their pursuit of holiness, their pursuit of purity, the way that they love one another, the way that they treat one another, that is itself the evangelistic sermon of God's people. We don't have to utter a word. I mean, there's a time for that, obviously, but by and large, Israel's function was to live a certain way. And if they're doing that with integrity, then the world will know that God exists. And this is the kind of God that he is. He's a holy God. He's different than all other gods. As Peter exhorts this church, and he uses the example of, or the metaphor of being a temple, being a holy house that has been built up and is built on the foundation of Christ being a stone. And he uses this temple imagery to show that we are now where God lives. That through the Holy Spirit, God now lives in us. There's no longer a need to go to a temple to be in the presence of God. God now comes to us, and we are his temple. And so he uses the metaphor of being built into a living house of living stones, being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood. The function of a priest was to kind of be a mediator between the people and God. Right? God is holy. And by and large, we're not. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So we need a go-between. We need a mediator to communicate between us and God, and that was the function of a priest in the Old Testament. They offered the sacrifices. They made them holy so that God would accept them. And so a priest is a mediator. It's a go-between between unholy humanity and holy God. So when Peter says to his audience, you are a kingdom of priests, it's the idea that we mediate now between an unholy world and a holy God. That our function is to mediate between them, to be the go-between between them and God, to represent God in the lives of the people. Exodus 19 is the passage that Peter is working off of. I'm just going to read a couple of verses here, starting in about verse 4. This is Moses went up to God. The Lord called him from the mountain. So this is kind of God preaching to Moses before he gives him the Ten Commandments, kind of giving him a template of this is why we're doing this here. This is why we're having this conversation. I'm about to give you the Ten Commandments, but there's a prelude to that. I need to give you my rationale. And so this is we get in Exodus 19, starting in verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did in Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you out myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you're to speak to the Israelites. So what God is giving Moses is basically the definition of what his people are going to be. They're going to be a people, they're going to be a holy nation, they're going to be a kingdom of priests, and they're supposed to stand out. They're supposed to be different, and when the world looks in on the holiness of Israel, they gain insight into the holiness of God. They gain insight into the character of God. So again, it's this idea that as the world looks at us, if we're claiming to be Christians, it's really not us that they're seeing. They're seeing Christ. And what we're doing with our lives is either painting a noble picture of Christ or an ignoble picture of Christ. And it goes back to that, sort of message on the side of that bus. It's interesting what Peter does with this passage, and we're not going to go through and read it all, but he's basically echoing this Exodus passage, that what is said of the Old Testament people of God is said of the New Testament people of God. We talked about this in our Wednesday night class, that what is said of Israel is said of the church. The mission of Israel, to be a light to the world, is the mission of the church. I think a lot of times we read the Bible and we think, okay, well, God got it wrong with Israel, so he had to start over with the church. And then there's sort of this, this gap between, Old Testament and New Testament, and the two shall never be united because one's old and one's new. The problem is that the biblical writers didn't think that way. And what Peter does with his audience is the way that he quotes this passage, the way that he alludes to this Exodus passage, skip down to verse 12. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. Look back at verse 9. But you are a chosen people. Sound familiar? A royal priesthood, a holy nation. That's exactly the terms that God gave Moses. And now Peter is now applying that to the church. Notice Peter did not say, God told Israel that they were a holy nation, and now what I'm telling you. So it's not us, it's not them and us. It's not the old people of God and the new people of God necessarily. It's just the people of God. What is said of the Old Testament people of God is said of the new. The church is really a renewed Israel. Israel wasn't a mistake. Israel wasn't a group of people that God delivered and they just never could get it right, and he had to wipe the slate clean and start all over. Remember his promise to Abraham, through you and your descendants, I will bless the whole entire world. To be a light to the Gentiles. That's Israel's function, and it's exactly the function of the church. The church's mission is that of Israel, to represent holy God to the world. As one author put it, we are those whom God, in his grace, has chosen to sanctify. That is, to set apart for himself. That is, to be holy. So, in part, that's our mission. Holiness is a mission. Being holy is a mission, not just because, we want to be people of purity and people of integrity and, in its own right. No, it's because it points to God. It always points back to God. Whatever command God gives Israel, it points back to him. And whatever their function is in the world, it always goes back to him. It's always about God. And when the people who are not part of Israel see Israel, they should see something about Israel's God. So one major component of our mission that we've been talking about is simply the mission of being holy. So I kind of just want to ask the question, maybe this would help, change the sign on the side of the bus. Do we have a passion for holiness? As God's people living in a very unholy world. We talked about this at Manly Morning yesterday. At breakfast, Mark Ristaldi brought up the point that the world, due to media, the social media, and the internet, and all the messages that we receive each and every day, it just floods us with negativity and unholiness and immorality and just junk, for lack of a better term. And it just floods us with that stuff. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what is our passion? Is our passion to be different than that stuff? Or is our passion to kind of play along with it and be part of that? Do we have a passion of being happy? It's okay to smile. As a Christian, thank you, David. David's the only one smiling at this point, and he is radiating happiness. It's okay to be. We're not stuffy people, but if that's what we're giving off, then that's the message that we're giving about God. So a couple of things on holiness, and we'll conclude. Holiness is a given fact. The New Testament teaches that God has sealed us with the Holy Spirit. God identifies us as his own representatives. You're holy. The fact that God gives you his Spirit and that his Spirit lives in you, you're holy. That's a message that even Paul gave to the Corinthians, the most unholy church in the New Testament. Paul, at the beginning of that letter, calls them saints, which is the same word for holy. God has made you holy. You are his treasured possession. You belong to him. You exist to serve him. Your function is to allow God to do with you whatever he wants. We belong to him, just as Israel belonged to God as his treasured possession of all the nations in the world. We now belong to God. We are now part of that people. So holiness is a given fact. But, and this is a big but, holiness is a given task. It takes work to be holy. It takes effort to be holy. Maybe the better way of putting it is it takes effort to maintain our holiness. God makes us holy. But if we indulge in unholiness and immorality and the things of the world, we'll lose that holiness. We can quench the Spirit. And it's by doing those things that are contrary to the Spirit. So holiness is a task. And simply put, just be different. Now, if what drives that statement on the side of that bus is that they look at Christians who are really being holy and they have a problem with that, then so be it. I couldn't care less what they put on the side of a bus. If I'm being holy and if they don't like that and they think I'm not having fun, then that's their problem, not mine. So there's a sense in which holiness, should stand out. It should be different. And the world should take notice of that. In all of life, no aspect of life should be untouched by holiness. It's real easy to be holy here on Sunday morning, isn't it? Real easy to show up, come to church, and dress real nice. Even Delbert, and we come in here, and it's real easy to be holy. It's real easy not to yell at anybody. Real easy not to curse at anybody at church. I've seen it happen. Let it go, Warren. It's easy, but every aspect of our life, especially how we deal with our families, our worship, our work, our finances, being people of restraint, being people who don't indulge in the things of this world. We don't buy $500,000 houses just because we want that. there's a level of restraint. We're not people who buy $200,000 automobiles just because I can afford it, and I want that. I can't afford it, but I do want it, so that's the reason I can't have it. There's a little bit of difference there. But this is what holiness is. It's restraining the natural desires that God has given us. That's something the world doesn't do. And when they see people doing that, it gives them problem. Well, I like the way one author put it, we are a showcase of covenant obedience. A showcase. God puts us on display. It says, this is what people look like who are in covenant with me. This is what they look like. And the world sees us on display. And the idea is that they want that when they see that. If while on display we're bitter and angry and cantankerous and anxious and worrywarts, then what does that say about God? And finally, holiness is a pursuit. I want to be clear on this. It is a task, but you're going to mess up. It's a pursuit. It's a journey. And nobody is on the same part of that journey. The way that Paul, kind of laid it out for the Galatians, he said, grow in the fruits of the Spirit. He didn't say they're already in your life in abundance. We have to grow in that. And so we grow in our holiness, and, we trip and we fall, and it happens. But the difference between us and the world is we have a God who forgives us. By his grace, he forgives us and picks us back up, and we can begin the journey again. And so it's a pursuit of holiness. I'm going to read this lengthy quote out of this book that I'm reading as I wrap my mind around this idea of being missional people. Peter applies Exodus 19, 4 through 6, directly to Christians. You've had your Exodus experience, he says. You've tasted God's grace and mercy. You are his precious, treasured possession, his very own people. Now then, live by that story. Live out that identity, and live with such attractive obedience of good lives that people will be attracted to the God you worship. And whatever they say about you, they will come to glorify him. So when someone reads on the side of a London bus, there's probably no God, they should think, well, that can't be right. Because I know Kat. She's a person who lives, is a Christian who believes in God, and she lives a life of holiness and love and forgiveness and mercy. There probably is no God. That can't be true because I know Jeff. And Jeff is a person who lives a life of love and obedience and forgiveness and mercy and is happy and loves the God that he worships. There probably is no God. Well, that doesn't resonate because I know Kim. She has God in her life, and it's clearly manifested because she went all the way to Haiti to bring other people closer to him. So that message can't ring true with us. And it got a lot of traction in England, probably because in a way it does ring true. So again, it's this pursuit of holiness. It's this pursuit of happiness. It's this pursuit of being conscious of our representing God and reflecting him. So we all have a mission, and that mission is to represent God to the world. Whether it's in Honduras, whether it's in Haiti, whether it's at the Good Works Project that we do in Coatesville, or whether it's right here in King of Prussia, or whether it's in your family. Your mission is to represent God's holiness, to represent his love, to represent his mercy, and to live a joyful life, free of anxiety and worry. The mission is one of representation and reflection. Simply put, you want to know what your mission is? Be different. Be different. Be different from the world. That's your mission. And if we're doing that as a pursuit, and we're doing that conscientiously, the world will know the God that we worship. And as Peter says, they may even come to sing his praises. That's when we complete our mission, that the world who doesn't know God comes to know him through our lives. We'll stand and sing.